Let's talk combine testing. Combine testing is such an important part of building out the sports science curriculum that we've been working on. And it's interesting that we really got down this path of building out some sports science by participating in some combine tests. And we needed a group of students who were trained not only in doing some of the tests that were part of the combine, but then also understanding the science behind the tests. And so that along with this growing need nationwide for sports scientists, really drove the creation of this course, Foundations of Sports Science. So in this module for this week, we're going to focus on combine testing. Some of the tests behind the combine or that are involved in combine, as well as some of the science behind it. And so let me share my screen here. And so these are some pictures from some different combine tests that we have participated in or have led. A group of students, it's our traveling band of students, and it's never the same group every time, but we're able to bring students in to help run the tests, maybe to observe the testing that's going on. And it's really an important part of our curriculum because it gives students a chance to apply what they're learning in the classroom, apply that knowledge to real world situations. And we have our mobile lab, the Sport Performance Education and Economic Development Lab, where we can transport our equipment to either augment a combine that is currently going on or to actually lead a combine anywhere in the greater Las Vegas Valley. So let's talk a little bit about what combine tests are. Well, they're standardized battery of tests to evaluate athletic potential. So I also call it athlete performance testing. And the purpose is to quantify the physical capabilities as well as to predict sport-specific performance. It's another theme of doing the combine test is that you establish some baseline performance data following these standardized tests that can be used in recovery protocols if someone gets hurt during the course of a season. You can use these data as a return to play a threshold for determining whether or not someone has recovered enough to go back to performing in their sport. It's used in professional sports, collegiate sports, and in research settings as well. So the key components of a combine include the physical tests themselves, and the tests include tests for strength, for power, speed, agility, and endurance. Now, it's important to define each of those terms too when we're doing these types of tests or selecting tests, and you learn some of these definitions in different classes that you're in. There's also a skill-based component to combine tests often. It's a sport-specific movement. For example, when we did a soccer combine test with the Las Vegas Lights, there's some specific test for soccer skills. When we worked with the Raiders and their youth sport combine that they organized and we helped with, we did some of the physical tests, and then they had sport-specific football skills. And same thing with rugby. Rugby combine that we helped with, we ran the physical tests, and then the rugby coaches ran the rugby-specific test, and then they evaluated the players based on their performance in those types of tests. There's also physiological assessments that are often included. Maybe a measurement of VO2. VO2 max is very common to assess aerobic capacity, measuring lactate during some type of tests, and heart rate is a standard measure that is often measured. And sometimes our physical tests measure physiological, or they're designed to assess physiological performance, but we don't actually do the measurements of VO2 and heart rate and what have you. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And then another key component of a combine test are anthropometric measures. So height, weight, and body composition are very common measurements to take in these tests. Some example combine tests, 40-yard dash, or sometimes it's a 40-meter dash, depending on what sport we're working with. And that tests the acceleration ability of someone, the top speed that they have. But typically when we do a sprint test like this, we're measuring the total time to complete the distance. So it ends up being an average speed over that distance. Power is usually assessed using a vertical jump, counter movement jump, or squat jump, as well as a horizontal broad jump. And that's really getting towards this idea of explosive strength or power assessment of an athlete. Then there's some agility type of test, 5-10-5, where you run 5 yards in one direction, 10 yards in another direction, 5 yards back to the start. The shuttle, and then a T-test is just as it sounds. You run out, and then you change directions laterally. And we time those, and we get a measurement for 5-10-5 or the T-test, and this helps to assess the ability of an athlete to change direction. Strength tests are, there's a wide variety of them. I just put bench press here. We typically are doing a muscle strength. So something like a 1 RM, or sometimes a 3 repetition max, sometimes a 3. Sometimes we do a muscular endurance where it's a longer set, or how many reps someone can do with a certain rep or a certain weight. And we often do isometric testing as well. Isometric mid-thigh pull, isometric, and especially this picture right down here is an isometric test of the neck AB and AD ductors. That's very common to do isometric testing. And then an endurance test, which is a yo-yo test where you're running some type of distance back and forth, back and forth, back and forth over a sustained period of time. That's getting towards more of an aerobic capacity. We did this type of test with the Las Vegas Lights soccer team. They were very interested in the sustainability of their athletes to be running back and forth. And then there's some other tests pictured here, like a medicine throw ball. This is part of the 5-10-5. This is mid-side thigh pull. This would be a sprint test, kind of moving jump test. As I said, neck, AB, adductors, and this was a squat test. Sports science integration, combine testing does involve several different areas. Obviously, biomechanics is a big part of this. We're looking at some kinematic measurements and kinetic measurements. Kinematics is the study of motion. Kinetics is the study of forces causing motion. Sometimes we're trying to quantify the kinematics, velocity, for example, and sometimes the kinetics, isometric mid-thigh pull. Exercise physiology, we're really trying to assess different energy systems. Which system is being used in a 1 RM? We're looking at anaerobic capability. If we're looking at a yo-yo test, we're looking more towards aerobic capacity. I should have mentioned cycling tests we've done with some of the teams, doing like a Wingate 30-second test, which is a test of anaerobic power. And then some teams want us to do a VO2 max test for their athletes, so we're looking at aerobic power. Another element, we haven't done this ourselves, but some type of psychological assessment. This would be more for some of the pro sport teams where they assess motivation, focus ability of athletes, and that works into the combine test. And then nutrition is also a very important part of a combine test. What the athletes are eating before, during, and then after the combine event. Data and technology and combine testing, how we can collect a lot of data. And the portability of our equipment has really increased the ability to get field-based tests done. As opposed to athletes having to come through a laboratory, bricks and mortar lab, we're a little bit more limited in capacity of assessing athletes through a lab. But with portability of tools, we often do these combine tests. We typically will have 2 stations per test. So 2 kind of movement jump tests or stations to horizontal broad jump tests and so forth. But we do use force platforms quite a bit in the combine tests. Timing gates, motion capture of some sort. We have inertial measurement units, which are units that you put on segments, and we're measuring the acceleration. And these units also have gyroscopes, so we can get some kinematics without cameras. We also have some camera-based systems that we use to track athletes. Typically, the camera-based systems we're using are markerless systems. So the technology has advanced quite a bit, where we don't need to put reflective markers on anatomical landmarks. This is a huge advancement in combine testing, because putting markers on a person is time consuming. That reduces your capacity to process athletes. And we have some issues with markers falling off as people do really extreme movements, high accelerations. There's a high likelihood that markers that we put on different landmarks will fall off, and then we have to redo the test. And so using markerless systems has actually become really quite popular, and the technology is getting much better, where it's very useful for combine testing, and it's somewhat useful for research-based questions. We also do a hand grip test where we have a hand grip dynamometer, very common in most sports. It's interesting that hand grip strength is something that's correlated with a lot of different health metrics. And so it is a pretty standard test to include in a combine test. And applications of what we're doing the combine test for, we are trying to quantify performance metrics. And so really we are doing athlete performance testing. But we're also trying to track athlete development. So some of the teams we've worked with, we do a preseason combine, and then we come in during the season and do an abbreviated number of tests, more focused on some of the key metrics that the coaches are interested in. And so that's really tracking the athlete development over the course of a season. And as I mentioned earlier, it's you're collecting data that will help support return to play decisions. For example, if one side gets injured, you have a knee injury, you can start looking at symmetry or asymmetry between the left and right sides, the injured and the non-injured side, whichever one. And you can create some criteria for when the athlete is ready to go back to play based upon how similar the two sides are behaving in certain tests. So a little research insight. There's 2 papers that go along with this module that are hopefully interesting to read. This first one by Teramoto, where they were looking at predictive value of National Football League's scouting combine on future performance of running backs and wide receivers. It's a great paper to read. Don't get caught up in some of the statistical tests that they did. They are doing a predictive model. So there's a lot of what's called regression modeling, where you take a lot of different measurements and you try to use all those different measures to predict something. And then they were using different values to try to predict, to try to understand what elements of the combine test best predicted performance in the NFL. And what they concluded was for running backs, jump height, vertical jump height, and 10-yard dash time were very good predictors of rushing yards per attempt during the first 3 years and career totals. And so those were useful tests for if you're evaluating a running back, then you can look at the 10-yard dash time and vertical jump test and use that in your decision-making approach to selecting or not selecting an athlete. And for wide receivers, the vertical jump height was a predictor of receiving yards per reception. Just interesting. It's receiving yards per reception, but vertical jump height was the predictor for that. So some combine tests, just as I mentioned here, vertical jump sprint had predictive value, but overall, interestingly, the authors concluded that the combine tests themselves provided limited predictive power for NFL success. And that's okay. But what that means is that there's other factors beyond athletic testing or beyond these types of tests that were used in the combine that influence player performance. And that could go back to the psychological factor. It could be lifestyle factors or what have you. And so it's just an interesting read. And again, don't get lost in the stats and don't even focus in on that unless you love statistics. But certainly go through the introduction and the discussion section of this paper to get a good sense of what they were doing and what they found. The other paper by Wago and colleagues on the limits of high performance support, they were looking at really the performance team and what types of metrics you start looking at to help an athlete. So this is a broader look. It's not necessarily combine testing data, but it's more specific to looking at how to do evidence-based practice in that how do you take the science that's out there and apply it to a single athlete. And what they came up with is this term performance limiting factors, which was something that they were focused on trying to identify what is limiting an athlete to achieve or to do a certain skill. And once you got identifying that limiting factor, you can tailor the training program to remove that as a limiting factor. And the authors discussed the evidence-based practice where that's all based on the idea of using the best available evidence, the science, in decision-making for an athlete in terms of developing an athlete, setting up a training program, setting up a recovery program, what have you. But they also talked about practice-based evidence, where data should complement, not replace, coaching insight and athlete individuality. And so you have to merge these two worlds of saying, let's take what the science is telling us, but let's make sure that we're working with an athlete and what worked for this person. And I think that's a really important message. So hopefully you get through this paper and get some good insight on how sports science will help an athlete or help a team move forward. So limitations of combine testing and ethics of combine testing. Well, there's always fatigue and the injury risk. I don't mean to put those side by side, that meaning that they're correlated. But we do need to be careful about injury in doing this combine test. So it's very critical that athletes are performing the type of warm-up that's appropriate for the type of test that's going to be done. And in some of the combines we do that we've been part of or that we've done, there's a group warm-up session, and then there's some individual activities prior to some of the combine tests based upon what the athlete's going to be asked to do. And really what you're trying to do is minimize the risk of someone getting hurt during the course of the test. The fatigue issue is we've got to be careful with the order of tests so that fatigue doesn't necessarily negatively influence tests downstream. And so with some of the teams we work with, the order of some types like the Wingate test, we wanted that to happen at a certain sequence to avoid that, which is an all-out 30-second test, and you're pretty blown out after that. You don't want to go do some type of skill-based test right after that. Or if you do that, you got to understand that the test following the Wingate may have been influenced by the fatigue of the prior test. Something that's also really important is data privacy and consent. Interesting, when we go and do a combine with a team, the first question, well, not the first question, but one of the questions that we ask is it okay to take pictures and to post things on social media? Some teams are perfectly fine with it. Some teams are not, and they're more protective of the types of testing that they're doing and of the athletes and what they're doing for the different tests and how they're performing. And so this is something that we just deal with as we set up these combine tests. But this is also important from an athlete perspective in terms of who owns their data. Do they own the data? Does the team own the data? Or do the testers own the data? And that's important because there is a level of consent that does happen here, especially if researchers are involved and you're going to do a research study based upon the data that are reported from the combine testing. Anytime we do research, we have to make sure that the subjects involved are informed of the research and how the data are going to be used, because they may not want the data to be used in a particular way. Data loss of confidentiality may influence contract negotiations, for example. Maybe they do terrible on a particular test, and down the road, some executive gets a hold of it and says, wait a second, they did not do well in this combine test. Let's drop their projected salary to this range. You know, this is part of the reality of the business of sport, that there is data, there is protection that individuals have to have over their data. There is a risk of overemphasis of numbers, and I always use the phrase paralysis by analysis. We can get overwhelmed with looking at the instrument, looking at the output, and trying to adjust things based upon all the information that we get back. A lot of the instruments we have, they yield a lot of different metrics. And it's really important for the sports scientist to identify the key variables and key data that need to go back to the athlete, to the coach, to the strength, to the sports science team in general, the sport performance team. And a lot of times it's important to identify the actionable items, things that an athlete, coach, performance team, something that they can do something about. As opposed to things that we really are out of our control to manage. And so there is always a danger of diving too much into the data and ignoring the athlete. And then there is the issue of equity and tech access. If we start looking at the high school level, not all high schools have access to the different types of instruments that we use in combine testing. And so we do need to be thinking about how different schools have access to the same equipment so they can have the same benefit. This is part of the idea of the Speed Lab, is that we can take the Speed Lab out to a wide variety of schools and give them access to the science behind combine testing. Okay, take-home message, combine testing, the idea is that we're bridging the science and performance. All right, we're trying to do evidence-based practice. We're trying to measure something objectively and then use that information to make the best decisions for the athlete, for the team, organization, what have you. The idea, as I just said, provides objective insights, but interpretation requires expertise and context. And this is where I always say we want to continue to focus on the science of sport. So the sports scientist is not a technician. The sports scientist is trained to be able to take in all the different information that these tools are giving us and turn that into information that's useful for an athlete, a coach, sport performance team, and generates knowledge. Okay, that's it for combine testing. Thanks, everybody.